Namaskar, Tashdile. Good morning to Michael and our friends in United States. Good afternoon to our friends in Europe, and good evening to our friends uh, in Tokyo, in Australia, in Taiwan, and good evening to our audience in India. So today our webinar will be a little different than what we have been doing in the past. Instead of having uh, two or three speakers, today we are going to discuss a wonderful book. This book is Tibet Brief 2020, and the author, Michael van Walt. He's a very well known friend of Tibet, an international expert. Uh, I'll give his detailed introduction later. So we will talk to Michael van Walt about this book, the issues it is raising. And to start with, I'll give a very short introduction of the organizing groups and why we are doing it. This webinar is being organized jointly by the Center for Himalayan Asia Studies and Engagement. In short, we call it CHASE, which is a think tank and a platform which is focused on understanding issues which are impacting countries and societies around the Himalayan Asia region. Uh, and it's a platform for exchange of knowledge, views, perspectives among Indian and international experts, researchers, writers, advocacy groups, those who have keen interest on various aspects of political, social, economic, and strategic developments in this region. And then Tibetan Youth Congress, as everybody knows, is a worldwide organization of the Tibetan diaspora. It is functioning with the common cause of restoration of complete independence of whole of Tibet. When I say whole of Tibet means it includes the traditional Utsang, Kham, and Amdo. So TYC, as everybody knows, has evolved as the largest and most active non-violent, non-government organization of Tibetan diaspora. And it is, if I can say, it has evolved into a nursery of social, political, and cultural leadership in exile. So it has more than 30,000 members. So we will have Tenzin Lamo, who will represent TYC today. Uh, and then we have Professor Ayushi Ketkar, who will be handling question answer issues, and Anjali Mishra, who is our colleague handling media relations, a budding journalist. So coming to the book, now the main issue. Welcome to Michael van Walt. Michael, as I said, is the author, co-author of this wonderful book, Tibet Brief 2020. We are going to discuss this book today. This is co-authored by his co-author is Mick Valtes, and I think our audience knows very well Michael van Walt. He doesn't need much introduction, but still, uh, he is one of the oldest uh, friends of Tibet. He is a professor of international law. He's an international law jurist, and he had the privilege of being legal advisor to His Holiness Dalai Lama and the Central Tibetan Administration in Dharamsala. He has the credit of founding CREDA, which is a conflict resolution organization. He played very important role in conflict situations, like including Chechnya, the Abkhazia, Georgia, and he has studied 34 autonomous and self-government governance regimes to put the Tibetan struggle in right perspective. So he is a senior fellow at the Institute of Social Science at the University of California. And one of his very outstanding contributions has been founding the Unrepresented Nations and Peoples Organization, UNPO. So welcome, Michael van Walt, to our show. It's a privilege talking to you. for more than one reason. One is that you have produced a wonderful book. As a person, as a journalist, and as a friend of Tibet, I have been very closely watching Tibet for last 50 years. This is my 50th year. And during this course, I would say, I'm not exaggerating, this is one of the best books which has come out, which explains the case of Tibet, which places the position of Tibet in right perspective vis-a-vis claims of China. So, welcome, Michael, to our show.
Thank you so much.
Uh, so, after this long introduction and background, we come to the real issue of today's evening here. Of course, morning at US. Can I ask you, when we start with the basic question, why this book? And especially, it's very interesting when we see Tibet Brief 2020. And the cover page is very interesting, but 2020 is a little something new. Uh, can you please explain what does it mean?
Yes, so thank you so much for the introduction, and thank you for inviting me to this show. I look forward to talking with you and also with the people who are participating, and will have questions and comments. So the title of the book um, refers to 2020 refers to 2020 vision, which means clear vision. If you have perfect vision, you have 2020 vision. So that's what 2020 refers to, and not the year 2020, even though the book was actually published at the very end of 2020. So the book really was written to um, provide a clear picture of what Tibet is about, what the Sino-Tibetan conflict is about, to reinvigorate and reset international efforts at resolving the Sino-Tibetan conflict, but on the basis of a proper understanding of both the region's political history and corresponding international legal rights and obligations of the international community members of the states in the world. So the book is fundamentally about the international legal status of Tibet, and it answers the question, who has sovereignty over Tibet today? As you know, of course, the PRC claims it has sovereignty because Tibet has been a part of China since antiquity. And so the book examines every aspect of that claim. And I think it is unique in the sense that it covers all these aspects and pointedly debunks every aspect of China's claim over Tibet today. Have I lost you, Vijay?
Hello?
Yes, I lost you just then. I think you were on mute,
No,
but you're okay. I hear you now.
yeah, okay. So, uh, yeah, coming back to uh, as you started talking about the book's purpose, what we see, what I've been noticing for last, at least personally, for last 50 years of my involvement with Tibet, China's main claim is that Tibet has been always a part of China, an integral part of China. And your book has dealt point wise, point by point, if I can use the term, blasted this claim of China. Um, why this focus on this particular aspect, that the Chinese claims that Tibet has been always a part of China. Why China does it?
Um, well, China focuses on that because um, developing the narrative that it's developed, the historical narrative that Tibet has always been a part of China, is its only basis on which it believes it can claim legitimacy for its rule of Tibet. So China knows very well that under international law, it is prohibited to invade another country, to annex another country, and therefore to claim sovereignty over a territory that you've invaded by force. This is one of the most fundamental rules in international law, and China has been a proponent of that rule. So it cannot claim that it has sovereignty over Tibet because it invaded and occupies Tibet. So, but it needs a reason, a narrative, a logic for claiming that it has sovereignty and for claiming it has legitimacy for its rule over Tibet. And so what it has done is developed a historical narrative whereby Tibet has always been a part of China or has been a part of China since antiquity. And therefore, when the People's Liberation Army marched into Tibet and occupied Tibet, China claims that was not an invasion, it was not an occupation of an independent country. Quite the contrary, it was simply a re-establishment of a control over a part of China that had um, that it didn't have, that the Republic of China did not have tight control over. And so it is a way to prove to the international community that China has legitimacy for its rule over Tibet.
Mhm. So when you say that this is the only ground on which China can establish its legitimacy over over its control and rule over Tibet, this means dealing with history, because China has been quite a smart country in creating narratives, and I know it's not very easy to deal with or handle China's narrative, which it has evolved over years, over decades. So, would you explain how did you deal with this this assignment of you know going into history? Uh, what kind of research work was there behind your book?
Um, well, it's been a long process. Mick and I worked on this for over 10 years. And it was really a two-stage process. First, we worked on understanding the broader context of Inner and East Asian history since the empire of Genghis Khan, since the 13th century to the present time. And then we moved to Tibet-specific study of Tibet's relations with dominant empires of Asia and Tibet's own history. So the first part resulted in a book that you may have seen also, which is called Sacred Mandates, Asian International Relations since Genghis Khan. And we co-authored that with Timothy Brook, who's a very well-known sinologist. And we worked on that book and on the Tibet Brief 2020 with about 100 top scholars around the world, interdisciplinary, multidisciplinary. So we organized seminars in universities around the world, in North America, in Europe, in Asia, and elsewhere. And we delved into each aspect of the history, looking at the original source material in different languages. And this is precisely why we had to work with so many scholars, because neither Meek nor I can work with, speak, or read many of these languages. For example, Manchu, Tibetan, Chinese, of course, Mongolian sources were looked at, Persian sources were looked at, of course, Russian, and Western ones as well. And so that process of working with scholars took, as I say, about 10 years until we completed the second book.
Oh, see, Michael, what we see, you spoke of long research. You know, about 100 scholars were involved, and you took 10 years and went to resources, history resources of other countries. You know, this is one issue which we find that today the whole world has, I don't know why, but the what we see today, it is only the Chinese narrative which is working, whether it is international universities, whether it is diplomatic establishments of even those countries which are in direct clash with China, and those countries which are said to be, you know, nowhere in any dispute. But all of them, including media, we find that they are overwhelmed by the Chinese narrative of history. So it doesn't appear to be a very easy assignment to to take the Chinese narrative head on. Do you think this process was easy, or mm, yeah, how it was, this process, how difficult or easy it was?
Well, I mean, the test is going to be how effective this book will become, and that depends on, the book was really written not just to read or as a purely academic exercise, but it was written to really be used, and so it's really going to depend on how um, Tibetan diplomats, how um, anyone who's interested in Tibet, and most importantly, how Tibetans use um, the contents of the book, use the arguments in the book, and whether they can use that effectively to change the tide, to move people to understand the truth, understand the real situation. I mean, I think now most non-Tibetans are not really aware that Tibet is an occupied country. And as you know, Vijay, this was not the case 20, 30, 40 years ago. People were very clear, government officials and just most of the public was very clear that Tibet had been invaded and was occupied. This is no longer the case because of the success of the Chinese propaganda, as you rightfully point out. And so people are now not just people are just no longer questioning China's narrative, using even Chinese vocabulary that is very vocabulary that has an important legal and political meaning, and people use it inadvertently, I think, without
Yeah,
even realizing the harm that it is doing. So, for example, China insists that Tibetans are just one of China's minorities, and
I,
uses the term ethnic minority or religious minority or simply minority of China. And many people have taken over this vocabulary. So in the media, you see a lot of references to Tibetan minority, but even government spokespeople and government documents in different countries use and refer to Tibetans as a minority, in many cases as a religious minority of China. And this and many other ways in which China has colored our vision is really impacting how people understand what the Sino-Tibetan conflict is about, and therefore also how it should be addressed and what the obligations are of the international community of different countries around the world in their relations to China and Tibet and to the Tibet-China conflict.
Yeah, I agree with you because to give the latest example, only 2 days ago, when Chinese foreign minister made a reference to Kashmir while sitting in Pakistan and attending this Islamic countries organization, where when Indian government replied to it, it was very strange. They said that we don't make references to internal matters of China. Why China should make in ours? You know, there we see that it is an indirect or a direct admission that Tibet or Xinjiang or South Mongolia are internal matters of China. This is where this thing needs to be corrected, and I must say your book has done really good work. One aspect of your book which I would like to share with our audience is you have done a remarkable work. I must admire. If I just take out some pages of the book, the graphic presentation of the history, this, uh, even a person like me, knowing Tibet, trying to understand Tibet for last 50 years, I could never make it look at it so easily. So the way in your book you have gone presented the history in a graphic manner, which in one view, a single site, you can immediately see how the history has developed over ages, over centuries. This aspect of China trying to convince the whole world, or Xi Jinping is now trying to tell the whole world that Tibet is a part of China, and Tibet uh, got the PRC got it in inheritance, or even Republic of China got it in inheritance. This claim of China that Tibet belongs to China as a matter of inheritance. How do you handle this claim of China?
Um, that's a big question because it really involves looking at the whole at the whole history, because of course China claims that um, China presents, or the PRC presents, Chinese history, and this is not unique to the PRC, but it is the Chinese worldview. That Chinese history is a history of seamless succession of dynasties, of Chinese dynasties that ruled China and a large part of Asia. Um, and when you really look at the history, and we only, as I said, looked at it from the 13th century to the present time. But when you look at those hundreds of years, it is very clear that China was ruled by Chinese dynasties for only a relatively short amount of time in that period. Mostly it was ruled by inner Asian empires, by inner Asian emperors, the Mongolian emperors, the Manchu emperors, both from inner Asia. And this is the main issue that I think is still largely misunderstood in the world. That the Yuan dynasty has been presented as a Chinese dynasty, whereas in effect, the Yuan dynasty was simply a part of a very large Mongol empire that stretched from, as you know, from the Pacific all the way to Eastern Europe and the Middle East, Western Asia. And China was one part of that empire. It's the same thing as their claim regarding the Qing dynasty, which they also claim was a Chinese dynasty, whereas it was in effect, again, an inner Asian empire, not a Chinese empire.
Yeah.
And the fact that those two empires included China doesn't make those empires Chinese. And
Yes.
I mean, just India would know this very well. China was the jewel in the crown, so to say, of the Qing Empire and
Yeah.
of the Mongol or of the Eastern Mongol Empire. But that didn't make those empires China or Chinese, just as India being the jewel in the crown of the British Empire did not
You are
make
you
that
you know.
empire Indian.
Yeah.
And we're not talking about the British Empire and calling it India. And India cannot
Michael.
really claim all the past British imperial possessions, protectorates, etc.
Yeah. Michael, if I can add one point to what you are saying. In
Yes.
your book, I read, and if I'm not, my calculation is not wrong, as you said, that China was ruled by the Manchus and Mongols. And your book shows that I think more than 700 or almost 750 years, China was ruled by these two empires. And as you put it very rightly, that being part of the big empires doesn't make a claim that it was Chinese empire. I think it would be equally, it would be as absurd or as hilarious if today India makes a claim that Australia is part of India, or New Zealand uses the same logic and says India is part of New Zealand because we were part of the British Empire. When I
Yes.
read your book, I immediately it came to my mind that the same logic can be applied like that. uh, there is one very strange thing in Chinese propaganda. I was traveling through China at one stage. I forgot the year. There, the Chinese TV was gaga about some centenary or some celebration where they were celebrating Genghis Khan as the great son of China. This looks absurd and I can't use any other term. China has the cheek to claim Genghis Khan was son of China. So how, when they have been successful in running such propaganda, uh, how would you evaluate the ignorance of the world community about the Chinese propaganda and accepting it as it is on the face value?
If you go to Mongolia, to Ulaanbaatar, the capital of Mongolia, where there are these enormous statues of Genghis Khan and Kublai Khan and other um, Mongol emperors, they certainly do not project them as being sons of China, I can tell you. There is great pride in Mongolia that these great leaders conquered China and kept the Chinese subjugated. But China has to project this idea that a concocted idea that um, uh, all the peoples that are today part of the People's Republic of China, that are within the borders of the People's Republic of China, have always been part of this great Chinese family. The Mongols, the Tibetans, the Manchus, the East Turkistanis, all have been part of this great Chinese family forever. So in effect, what the PRC is doing is it is projecting today's state, the PRC, with its current borders, and in fact, with, as you know, with expanded borders, because they make claims in India, they sometimes make a claim to Mongolia, they make claims to the South China Sea, etc. In other words, with expanded borders, and they project that back into history using modern terms of sovereignty, modern concepts of sovereignty, of statehood, of majority-minority rights, etc., into a history in which it simply does not belong, into a history where those concepts had very different meanings, and where the relations were fundamentally different from what China is presenting today. But without that concocted narrative, it cannot claim legitimacy to any part really of Inner Asia that the PRC today rules.
Yeah. Uh, Let us come to the point when the Chinese claim that China ruled over Tibet. You know, they give so many references in history, um, like even the logic that the Tibetan king married the Chinese king's daughter. That is an example that the Tibet was part of China. You know, the way China has been trying to project that Tibet, they ruled over Tibet, or Tibet was took orders from the Chinese emperors. Uh, how do you deal with this Chinese claim?
You
How
mean
would you answer?
the claim of the marriage? That
No,
is
no, no, not marriage. The Chinese overall claim that their emperors have been ruling over Tibet, and Tibetan Dalai Lamas or Tibetan kings have been taking dictations from the Chinese emperors. This is what they are claiming today. How do you counter it? How do you put it in the right perspective?
all right. So again, if we go back to the Mongol Empire, there is no question that the Mongols subjugated most of Eurasia and included um, a subjugation of Tibet. So Tibet, one can say, was part of the greater Mongol Empire, but it was not part of the Yuan part of that empire, and it certainly was not part of China. So it doesn't make sense to say that a Chinese emperor during that time ruled over Tibet. Kublai Khan and his successors certainly did consider Tibet to be under their overlordship. There's no question about that. But they did so very clearly as the great Khan of the Mongol Empire and not in their capacity as the rulers of China,
Mm.
which was, as I said earlier, just part of their empire. The same must be said of the Qing emperors, who were very careful to make a distinction between in their relation with the Tibetans, with the Mongols, on the one hand, and their conquest and direct rule of China as a conquered territory, as a subjected people. Those things were kept very separate, very separate. In fact, and I think I described that, or we described that in the book as well. Um, uh, the real nature of the relationship between the Manchu emperors and the Tibetan lamas, the Dalai Lama and other senior lamas, was kept secret to the Chinese senior officials in the court and to the Chinese people, because if it was known that there was a relationship of equality between the emperor and another leader, that would affect, that would endanger his legitimacy in the eyes of the Chinese people, where the emperor is the son of heaven and rules over everyone. So it was kept secret by using only Manchu or Mongol or Tibetan language, so that the own Chinese officials could not read certain sensitive expressions of that relationship. For example, that um, imperial officials kowtowed, prostrated before senior Tibetan lamas, including the Dalai Lama and the Panchen Lama. This was kept from the knowledge of senior Chinese, just in the same way as this was not unique to Tibet. The Manchus also, for example, kept their treaties with Russia, in which the two emperors, the Manchu emperor and the Russian emperor, were equal. The two states were on a level of equality. That treaty, those two treaties, were kept secret from the senior Chinese in the court, by those treaties being written only in Latin, in Russian, and in Manchu, not translated in Chinese for 200 years, so that the Chinese would not know that the emperor had a treaty with another country on a level of equality. So by keeping these kinds of things isolated, it was very clear that the Manchu court was clearly distinguishing their relations with different peoples in different ways. And the relationship with the Tibetans under the Manchus never included integration of Tibet into China, not even into the empire fully integrated, and certainly not into China. Yes, the only time that there were Chinese rulers that ruled China during the Ming Dynasty, there were no significant political relations between China and Tibet. And the other time that a Chinese leader ruled China, which was during the Republic of China period, there was very clear that Tibet was independent at the time, that China had no significant presence in Tibet, certainly no authority, no influence, no impact in Tibet. So, and in fact, the two countries were at war for most of that time.
Yeah. And, when you were talking of Kublai Khan and the relationship, that event when Kublai Khan was in the process of massacring, if I can use that term, the Hans, the Chinese. So it was at that time when the Chinese emperors took help of Dalai Lama to use his influence over Kublai Khan to stop that genocide or massacre of the Chinese. Uh, don't you think Chinese owe that moral, I would say, debt to Tibet and Dalai Lama today? Don't you think so?
Well, one of the big influences of Tibetans in Asia has been the Tibetan Buddhism. What we develop in the first of the two books, Sacred Mandates, is this notion that there were in Inner and East Asia three major worldviews and three major legal orders, international legal orders that interacted with each other, and that determined how Inner and East Asia was ruled, and how relations between states there were. One being the Jinkisid Mongol worldview and international legal order, the other one being the Tibetan Buddhist worldview and international legal order, which was much broader and much more extensive than just Tibet, and the third being the Cynic worldview and legal order. And really, sadly, historians around the world have been following and have been interpreting Asian history almost exclusively from the perspective of the Cynic worldview,
Yes. Yeah.
and not given equal importance to the Mongol Jinkisid worldview and the Tibetan Buddhist worldview, all three of which at the time were on equal footing and coexisted. But to get to your point, this enormously important Tibetan Buddhist worldview and legal order had an enormous influence in Asia at the time. And I think its power still exists today and can have a very important positive impact on the way people relate to each other, and therefore also on the way that countries relate to each other and how leaders should behave. So yes, I think Chinese leadership today could learn a lot from um, Tibetan approaches to things.
Yeah. Uh, but going to that point that, as you said, the the view of history which dominates today is the Chinese view and not the others. This aberration we find at universities level, at the level of political scholars and politicians, governments, media. Today, when the environment is a little different, when word has come out of those last 30 years of accepting everything Chinese at its face value and without challenging the Chinese viewpoint, kowtowing China has become a norm as we see today. Uh, do you see that with changing environment, whether it is because of COVID or other political reasons, uh, the Chinese narrative is now going to give way to the reality of history? Or if I say it in, ask you in other words, do you see some wisdom in the world community, which includes politicians, governments, and scholars and academicians and all those people, to start understanding the reality of China vis-a-vis Tibet, vis-a-vis East Turkistan, vis-a-vis South Mongolia, etc.?
Yes, I think there is, and I hope that I think there is a change. I think there is uh, um, an opening up of understanding uh, Asia differently. I hope that it's going to be sustained, that it's not just a period. But I think it I think it is going. There is going to be a tide of change, and part of it has to do with the fact that in the past there was very little access to source material other than Chinese, um, and so our perceptions were um, strongly influenced by sinologists who obviously study Chinese sources to understand history. Now there is access also to, since the end of the Soviet Union, to Mongolian source materials. There has been increasing the access to Tibetan source materials. There's more Tibetologists today who read and study Tibetan, just as there's more Mongolists who study Mongolian. So, and there are more scholars now that read and understand Manchu, all of them essential to understand Asia. So that has changed, I think. And so there are more and more books that come out that give a more balanced view of history. And I should say that this is particularly true in the West, that there's this change, because in the past, in the West, we were very much focused on the cynic view, because I think Europeans approached Asia from China through
Yeah.
the coastal ports of Shanghai, Hong Kong, etc., etc.
Yeah.
And so that's how they viewed Asia, through the eyes of the Chinese. But Russians, for example, have always understood Asia differently because they see it from an inner Asian perspective. And Japanese and Koreans have fantastic scholarship um, on Asia, on the Qing, on the Yuan, that projects precisely the kind of understanding that we present in the book as well. And they've done this for hundreds of years. It is
Yeah.
just Europeans and Americans that have had this somewhat narrow view of the history. So
Yeah.
I think that now there is a potential for really changing that. That's one aspect. The other is, of course, the political situation today, where people are starting to understand China's current political leadership better, and all the hopes that China would change by that the Communist Party would change by constructive engagement economically and politically with the rest of the world, I think is now seen to be what it was, which is an illusion. If anything, the present leadership of the PRC has become much more totalitarian, much more authoritarian than it was 20 years ago. And so
Yeah.
we're seeing a worse situation throughout the PRC, but certainly in Tibet, in East Turkestan, in Inner Mongolia, situation are really very bad. And internationally, of course, China is flexing its muscles in ways that is threatening many other countries, including India, of course.
So, as you put it rightly, uh, the viewpoint of Europe and America, uh, even if it was limited, but it has been prevailing over past many decades. Now things are changing. The absurdities of Chinese claims like Tibet was always a part of China, or they talk of the seamless inheritance of Tibet and Xinjiang, etc. Now the word is realizing it. Do you think this change or the development is going to lead to a situation where occupied countries like Tibet and Xinjiang, South Mongolia, they can hope for what we call self-determination?
Well, um, I do hope so, yes. Sadly, uh, we are now all very aware of what's been happening in the Ukraine. Um, but one of the things I think that it's brought home is the virtually unanimous condemnation of the invasion and occupation of, or the attempt at occupation, but certainly invasion of a smaller country by a big neighbor. Um, and that, I think, is bringing home the illegality of invasion and the similarities between what is happening today in the Ukraine and what has happened 70 years ago in Tibet, and the illegality of both. So hopefully that will wake up in people's minds, um, bring back the reality of the situation in Tibet. Um, yes, Tibetans have the right to self-determination. Tibetans are a people under international law, not a minority, as I mentioned earlier. Tibet is under colonial rule, and that is something I think that is, even though the historical situations of East Turkestan, Tibet, and Inner Mongolia are very different, Southern Mongolia are very different, but um, the similarity is that today all three are under Chinese colonial rule, alien subjugation, domination, and exploitation, to use the legal language appropriate to it. And so all three have the right to self-determination, to determine, in other words, by whom and how they want to be ruled. So they have the right to determine their status as part of the PRC, as independent states, or anything in between. And obviously they also have the right to determine their own economic, social, cultural development, and very importantly, the right to self-determination brings the right to um, the natural resources in the land of the people who have the right to self-determination. So Tibetans have the ownership and right to the natural resources in Tibet. And what that also means is that the People's Republic of China has the obligation under international law to permit Tibetans to exercise self-determination. And the international community, in turn, has the obligation to help bring about Tibetan self-determination, and the obligation not to help China prevent Tibetans from exercising the right to self-determination. But of course, all this depends also on Tibetans having to press the international community to live by their obligations. So they have to claim the right to self-determination and um, demand of the international community that they play their part.
Oh, you raised the issue of international law and how the governments conduct themselves on, especially on issues like Tibet, East Turkestan, etc. Do you think uh, there will be some, I'm not saying change of heart, but realization among the governments, among world institutions like the United Nations, to at least ensure that international law is followed by China when, in context of these occupied countries like Tibet and East Turkestan? Uh, can we hope that this change is going to come? As far as Tibetans move, you mentioned Tibetans' determination or their efforts to. I'll come to that question later. But right now, the way international governments are behaving, they are accepting Tibet as an internal matter of China. Which is, can we expect that change of heart or change of approach?
Well, this is precisely what the book is trying to do. It's trying to make clear that Tibet is not an internal matter of China. It is the responsibility of the international community, um, and the international community has obligations. They must behave in a way that does not support China's occupation of Tibet, um, and they have an obligation to help end the occupation and find a sustainable resolution to the Tibet-China conflict. Do I think that it is possible that it happens? I think so. I think again, and I'm bringing up the Russian invasion of the Ukraine again because this has really woken up people to the since a long time there hasn't really in the West, at least in Europe, there hasn't been this experience of a major invasion. Yes, Russia invaded Chechnya, but the status of Chechnya was a different one than the Ukraine, which is a fully independent state. But the fact also that I don't know if you listened to President Putin's speech on the eve of the invasion of the Ukraine. He used precisely the same arguments that China has used on Tibet, saying that the Ukrainians are not a distinct people; they're part of the greater Russian family since time immemorial. That the Ukraine is not really a state. That they're intervening because of Russia's own security concerns, um, and that they are liberating the people from oppression and genocide. All very and Nazification. All very similar to the type of arguments that China has used. Again, I mention it because this is at least in Europe and the West, is waking people up to the reality of this type of situation, um, and therefore also to the dangers of China's expansionist agenda. I mean, it's very clear what China is doing in the South China Sea, its attitude towards its aggressive posture towards Taiwan, the genocide in East Turkestan, its very dominating presence in Nepal, its blatant interference in Mongolia, including in its elections, and of course, its very aggressive stance on India's borders and its claim to large tracts of Indian territory. Now, none of these things are separate from or unrelated to China's invasion of Tibet. Both because the narratives that China uses are related to the same narrative it uses in Tibet, and of course, in relation to India, because there would not be a border conflict if China had not occupied Tibet. So
Yeah.
I think all of this, China's posturing, is creating a an awareness that did not exist before of the danger of appeasement. And if there is appeasement on Tibet, on East Turkestan, or elsewhere, then this sends a signal to China that the world may accept further expansion as well.
Yeah. We come to one point. You referred to the Tibetans' efforts about regaining their right to self-determination. There is something which many people are feeling confused about. What has happened in recent decades, that Dalai Lama appears to have accepted the idea of Tibet as a part of China. There are many conditions also attached to it, but this basic uh, utterance from the highest leader that they are ready to accept Tibet as a part of China, don't you think this somewhere disheartens the supporters of Tibet and those who want to see these occupied countries free?
Yes, of course, I cannot speak for His Holiness. But I do, as I understand it, neither His Holiness nor the Central Tibetan Administration have ever accepted China's narrative. What I have heard His Holiness say is that the reality is that China controls Tibet, and in that sense, Tibet today is, yes, it's under Chinese rule. In other words, it's part of the PRC in that sense. That does not mean that the PRC possesses sovereignty or legitimacy to rule
Yeah.
Tibet, and I don't think that's ever been said. It is therefore just, if you like, an acknowledgement of the reality on the ground, and of course, His Holiness has said, and the CTA's position is that if, and I think that's the important part, if a mutually beneficial negotiated agreement is reached with Beijing on the lines of the middle way approach, then as part of a package guaranteeing a robust and extensive autonomy for the whole Tibetan people,
Yeah.
and therefore also its territory. I mean, this is not a cultural autonomy that Tibetans have been proposing to the PRC. It's political territorial autonomy, but an autonomy that will enable Tibetans to protect and develop their culture. And only if that happens, to then accept that Tibet can be a part, a genuinely autonomous part of the PRC. In other words, as a place with a special status within the framework of the Chinese constitution. But this is conditional. In other words, it's the idea of envisioning a package deal, and so there has not been a recognition that Tibet, as far as I know, that Tibet is legitimately a part of China. And that would make negotiations, if that kind of recognition were being given by the Tibetans before reaching an agreement, that really would make negotiations very difficult, if not really meaningless from for the Tibetans. And this is also what. But you're completely right that it has been confusing, and I think I have encountered Western leaders, uh, foreign ministry officials, etc., that also are confused by it, and they say, well, why should we not recognize that Tibet is part of China if the Tibetans or the Dalai Lama already does? And I've explained to them the same I've just explained now, that it is very different to say that Tibet is part of China and then have that as a starting point for discussions on the future of Tibet, from saying that there is a willingness to consider or to accept uh, Tibet as a special status part of the PRC in future if a satisfactory agreement is reached. And I think that when explained this way, a number of government officials understand that it is harmful for them to recognize or to make statements to that explicitly or implicitly um, recognize Tibet as a part of China, because it really harms the Tibetan negotiating position. It harms even the possibility of any negotiations taking place.
Yeah, I agree with you that this issue has been a bit confusing even for the best of friends of Tibet, the best of supporters of Tibet. And to would you agree if I say that now, because the word is very different, it's not the word of 1980s when the whole world wanted to kowtow to Beijing, and today world is having a very very different opinion about Beijing and its intentions. Now most of those hopes and fears are already over. The world understands the reality of China and its aggressive behavior. Do you think we can hope that the Tibetan side, especially His Holiness the Dalai Lama side, uh, is going to rephrase at least, this statement to make it more clear to his friends and those who want to be helpful?
I think for a number of years, but certainly um, at this time also, um, and I mean, let's be clear, it's the Central Tibetan Administration now that has the political responsibility. Um, and so the CTA, I think, has been um, very clearly stating that Tibet has not been a part of China, is not part of China, um, and is also asking governments no longer to state that Tibet is part of China. So I think that the on the Tibetan side, on the CTA side, a clearer position has been evolving, has been developed, and I think the confusion was largely during the time that the dialogue was taking place, just
Yeah.
before and during the time that dialogue was taking place, those 10 years of dialogue between Dharamsala and Beijing, when, as you remember, His Holiness and the CTA wanted to leave no stone unturned, to use their language, to ensure that the atmosphere was appropriate for and conducive to negotiations. And I think, uh, and for all the good reasons, to ensure that negotiations were given a real chance. But during that time, um, I think some confusion resulted uh,
Yeah.
from that for those reasons. I think now, more recently, that there has been a resetting of the Tibetan um, statements, positions, etc.
Oh, that's very reassuring.
Which doesn't mean that the CTA is not in favor of a middle way approach. That position still remains very solid and the same. But there is very clearly now an effort to make clear that this does not mean that the Tibetans recognize Tibet to be a part of China, or that they accept the Chinese narrative, and that the rest of the world should also not do that.
Oh, the way you have explained, it's very reassuring, especially for our those members of the audience who are who are supporting from their heart the cause of Tibet, especially its independence. That's very good. Wonderful. I thank you for explaining that. Now I come to the final conclusion question. In your book, you have very explicitly, very clearly mentioned a list of what you call do's and don'ts, where you say the policy recommendations for a course correct. Those friends who have this book, the page is 232, where you have mentioned 9 points of what is expected of the international community on Tibet. Um, can I ask you to very precisely explain those points? And I think that should be the concluding question of our discussion.
Well, to summarize them, really the essence is um, that governments, but I think also this doesn't is not limited to governments. Also, NGOs and others have a responsibility. The media has a responsibility not to recognize Tibet as a part of China. As I said, nothing, not to explicitly or to implicitly recognize Tibet as a part of China, all of the PRC, to do nothing to lend legitimacy or a semblance of legitimacy for Chinese rule in Tibet, to do nothing to help the PRC to strengthen or maintain its control over Tibet, to do nothing to contribute to or help the PRC exploit Tibet's resources, which belong, as I mentioned, to the Tibetans, and to help bring about an end to the occupation and colonial rule of Tibet through an exercise of self-determination. And self-determination, an example of self-determination can be negotiations between Dharamsala and Beijing, the way that the CTA envisions that. That is one possible road to self-determination. So China policy should center on denying China the benefits of its occupation of Tibet, including denying its recognition of its claim to sovereignty until the conflict is satisfactorily resolved. And then whatever comes out of the agreement is what the international community should support. But the course correct, in other words, the recommendation makes clear that as long as the international community does not challenge China's claim to Tibet or continues to give the impression that they recognize Tibet as part of China, there is very little incentive for the Chinese government, for the Chinese leaders, to enter into negotiations with Tibetans. And even if they did, there would then be very little incentive to resolve the issue in a mutually useful way. If they were to agree to autonomy, it wouldn't have very much meaning. And so it is really very important that there is this course correct, that it takes place. And the other recommendation, groups of recommendation, has to do with a point that I mentioned earlier, which is the use of language. Let us please be careful about the language that is used. Let us kind of alert media people not to use language that implies Tibet's part of China, and also that suggests that Tibetans are a minority as opposed to a people and an occupied country, because the legal consequences of being a minority versus being a people or a country are quite important. Just to give you an example, generally speaking, minorities do not have the right to full self-determination the way that distinct peoples and occupied countries have.
Yeah.
So let us make an effort also to use language that reflects the proper situation that Tibet's in.
Oh, thank you very much, Michael. The way you have explained various issues which you have raised in the book, and that makes it very, uh, many of those confusions and issues clear about Tibet. And I hope this has been very useful for our audience. And because this discussion is going to be available on the YouTube for a very long time term, so I'm sure those who have interest in Tibet, those who want to understand the issue of Tibet or Chinese occupation or China's colonial rule over countries like Tibet and East Turkistan, South Mongolia, etc., people will gain out of this discussion, and especially your book. Thank you very much for producing this book. I say it as a person who has watched Tibet closely for 50 years, and many like me have been waiting for such a document, which is just one point window to understand the reality of Tibet, to understand the truth or falsehood behind the Chinese claims over Tibet and other occupied countries. So I once again thank you very much for this discussion. And now I think we have our colleague, Professor Ayushi Ketka. She must have got a few questions for you about this. Ayushi is a professor at Jawaharlal Nehru University,
Yes.
specializes in international relation and security matters. So, Ayushi, uh, we will, the mic is yours. Please.
Uh, the discussion has been so comprehensive that many of the questions that have come about, they've already been answered with discussion that you had with Michael sir. But just a couple of more, two questions that I would like to just put across. One is our very own team member, Anjali Mishra. She wants to understand the entire process of writing this book. She it's more of a private your journey, she wants to know the process of writing this book and what would be the significance of such literature, because clearly China's gatekeeping on the information is very strong. So that's her viewpoint, and she would like to know your entire process. And there's another very interesting question from research point of view by Jaya Roy. She says, Michael, so you mentioned in your talk that 1987, the situation in East Timor, it had great relevance to Tibet's case in international law. She wants to know if this still holds true to this day. So these are two questions that have immediately come about.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Um, I've already explained something about the process of the book, so I'm not going to go into too much detail. Um, uh, what could I say more about it? So essentially, as I mentioned, it was working. It was a cooperative effort, working with scholars all over the world, because it doesn't make sense to try to reinvent the wheel, to study things that other people already have great expertise in. And so that's what we focused on, was finding the right experts, whether they were Mongolists or Manchu specialists or um, and scholars from everywhere. I mean, scholars from inside the PRC, Tibetan scholar from inside Tibet, um, uh, and scholars from Russia, from Europe, from North America, from South Asia, from East Asia, etc. And we met in different university settings, hosted by different universities, and had seminars that were mostly about 3 days, about between 20 and 30 people in a room for 3 days, very intense presentation of ideas, of papers, discussion of them, um, and then extracting the information from that. Um, so I think part of the process itself was already beneficial. In other words, in strangely enough, and I didn't know this before, but you find that in the field of Asian studies in particular, people are very compartmentalized. So you have sinologists, you have Mongolists, you have people who study Indologists, you have people who are specialized in Himalayan studies, and there isn't very much mixing of ideas and cross-fertilization of ideas. And this is even truer if you look at the different languages that are used for the research. So, for example, Japanese scholars who are wonderful scholars. I mean, there is so much depth in Japanese research and scholarship. But very little of Japanese scholarship is translated into any other languages. And so it remains within Japan. A lot of foreign languages are translated to Japanese, so the knowledge does go to Japan, but very little of what is developed in Japan actually makes it outside. And so what was really exceptional was getting all these people together and exchanging views from very different academic perceptions, from very different academic type of scholarship as well. And developing respect for each other that way. So I think that was really quite an eye-opener for many of the people who participated in those meetings, and I think that was very useful. I think it's going to have an impact. In fact, the book Sacred Mandates has already received the 2021 prize for the best teaching book on Asian international relations from the International Association of Asian Studies, which we are very pleased with, because it means that it's kind of a recommendation for professors and others to assign the book and teach from it, and it will give a different view to the students and a new generation of scholars, I hope. And of course, we're not the only ones who are looking at the world differently than we did before. There's many other scholars that are doing that as well. And I think hopefully that is having an impact. As far as East Timor is concerned, yes, East Timor is an important precedent. East Timor was, as you know, invaded and occupied by Indonesia in 1975, and so the sequence of events was very similar to what happened in Tibet. The claims on the side of Indonesia were very similar to those claims that China has made. And the international attitude on the whole was very similar to what happened in Tibet. In other words, there was a lot of appeasement. I think that before East Timor regained its independence, there was a general feeling internationally, and I heard it many times, of yes, of course, they may be right. East Timorese may have the right to self-determination. They may have the right to independence. But the reality is Indonesia is a huge country, and East Timor has a small population of less than 1 million. So, we just have to accept the reality and make the best of it. I think many people still think that way about Tibet as well. And in East Timor, they've been proved wrong. The determination of the East Timorese people was extremely strong. But East Timor had the advantage that it had a few countries that supported it at the United Nations. And as a result, the United Nations itself also never recognized East Timor as being a part of Indonesia. So there was a legal situation that was a little clearer than it is in the case of Tibet in the perception of many countries. And that's what we need to change. We need to make sure that it is clear for all members of the international community that China does not have sovereignty over Tibet, and therefore that it's a matter of time until the occupation has to be ended or an agreement has to be reached that creates a different status for Tibet.
Just last set of questions, sir. Uh, One is, this is very interesting when you talk of Asian international relations. As a discipline itself, international relations is considered an Anglo-American discipline. So in that sense, I think you're making a very valuable contribution by bringing in these various paradigms into the entire discipline of international relations, which will make international relations that much more richer. And it breaks away from the shackles of Occidentalism. So I think that's
Yes.
that's amazing work that you're doing. And we here in India, and my mentor Vijay Kranti sir does that quite often. We talk of in the Indic perspective. So in that sense, that civilizational wisdom that we have, that can be brought in. On the question front, I have two very important questions, and you're the best person to answer this. One is the importance of narratives in a world of fake information. Now, where you are not sure what is right and what is wrong, how important is it, this narrative creation, the process of narrative creation, and the impact that it has on the hearts and minds of people? So that is one question. And second, a very important matter that you mentioned is the importance of terminology, using the right word or the right parlance in that sense. So I would like your take on these two very important issues, narratives and terminology. And finally, one last question that says that your book, this is about your book, it says that your book mentions a lot of historical aspects. How much of this book's content do you think is relevant for the current times? So I think with that,
I'm just going to start with the last question first. Um, History is not only important because we can learn something from it, and that's not what this book's purpose is, but to the extent that history is used as a pretext or as a reason to act today, it's important to understand what is true and what is false in that history, or in the way that the history is presented, and we get back to the narratives that way. And let's not forget that we're not looking at history simply because it's an interesting exercise. China has put history at the center of the Sino-Tibetan conflict. It's not the Tibetans that have done it. China, by making history its only argument for its right, its claimed right, its purported right to rule Tibet, is making history central. It is saying it is because of history that we are here. It is because of history that we have the right to rule Tibet and do what we want in Tibet. And so we have to look at history and say, you're wrong. History does not give you that right. And you don't have any other source of legitimacy. You don't have any other source that gives you that right. So that's why history is essential. That's why Tibetans, everybody, but Tibetans in particular, Tibetans first and foremost, must really internalize and understand their own history in a way that makes them feel confident enough to respond to anyone on this matter of whether Tibet was part of China or not. And I know that many Tibetans, and I mean not just Tibetans, many people, but many Tibetans and many Tibet supporters also are not that confident about how to respond to some of the claims made by China, especially around the Qing period, etc. And many scholars you will hear also have very ambiguous views about that. So yes, I think that understanding history, or the essential portions of it, details are not always important, is important, and that's why we do spend a fair amount of the book, not the whole book, but a fair amount of the book on it. The book is policy oriented, and it's written as Vijay was showing, and I hope it is true, in a way that is really readable, that is not only for experts, but that is accessible to a wide audience. Yes, and narratives are very important. Maybe the fact that we're now so much more aware than we were in the past, or that everybody is so much more aware of the past, about fake news, about the effects of propaganda, about the dangers of it. What happens if people are inundated with false information? What happens when we can't agree on facts and all live in our own world of what is truth? And of course, it's always existed in the world, but I think now we've really brought it to a point where we can't avoid realizing what damage this does. I hope that realization helps people understand Chinese propaganda, helps them understand that what we've thought, or what some people have thought, was a narrative based on valid information, on valid facts, is in fact a fabricated,
Yeah.
misleading presentation of facts. That doesn't mean that all the facts that China brings into this discussion and into its books, etc., is false, but the interpretation, the presentation, the narrative is false and misleading. And I hope that people will realize this is just another bit of fake news that we need to distill and separate from the reality. And for us to understand the reality, we have to look at where we can find proper facts. And I hope that my book is just one of the places where people will consult. And it's up to them to make up their minds what they think makes most sense and is most valid. And terminology is very tied to all this, because certainly when you talk about concepts like sovereignty and statehood and all of this, minorities, all of this terminology, we tend to be very lax about. We tend to throw it around in very general ways, and the press certainly does that also. And yet they all have very precise meanings and context. So all of those terms that we use in today's modern context has very precise political and international legal meanings, as you very well know. And so we can't transport those terms into past history, into past and different civilizations, and expect that they have the same meaning. They didn't, and they don't. But China is trying to give us the impression that they did. Also, in their discussion on the South China Sea, they talk about sovereignty as if what happened 400 years ago had the same consequences legally as what sovereignty means today, which is just absurd. It doesn't make sense. So yes, using the proper language, I think, is very important, not just because these things have these very precise meanings that should be understood, but also because it creates a certain picture and image in our minds immediately. If we talk about a religious minority, you have a certain sense of it. And it is very different than if you talk about an occupied country. And you meet in somewhere in your brain, it tells you that one has different rights, and that if you're a minority, that's an internal matter of a country, even though there may be human rights and other concerns and minority rights that the international community can legitimately get involved in. But it is a completely different category of intervention that is required internationally when there is an issue of minority rights, and if there's an issue of a country being occupied, a country being invaded, and a people not being allowed to to exercise its right to self-determination. And so, yes, I think using terminology and repeating it constantly, I think, is very important.
Oh, thank you, Aishi. And I think now it's time to conclude. So, may I request our friend and the co host of this webinar, the Tibetan Youth Congress Secretary of International of Information and Social Actions, Tenzin Lamo, to please say your vote of thanks. Tenzin Lamola.
Touch the leg. Thank you, Vijay Kranti ji. So with this, we come to the end of today's webinar. And in this webinar, we had very interesting discussion about the book called Tibet Brief 2020, and which mainly stresses on importance of recognizing Tibet independent history. And we appreciate his brilliant work in this book, and this book will remain. This book will surely remove any doubt that People Republic of China presence in Tibet is unlawful, and also how this book beautifully described that how Tibet was historically never part of China, and thank you for clearing all the doubts in this book. Therefore, I, on behalf of Tibetan Youth Congress and Chase, extend our sincere thanks to Professor Michael for bringing out this very fact and taking your time to discuss the same in today's webinar. Thank you so much, Professor.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.
Okay.
Thank you for
Secondly,
inviting me.
thank you. Secondly, we thank Vijay Kranti ji, the host and the chairman of the Chase, for always being there in bringing out timely discussions, timely topics for the all the discussions. And most importantly, we thank Vijay Kranti ji for constantly supporting us in our freedom struggle. Thank you so much, Vijay Kranti ji. And thirdly, we thank Professor Ayushi Ketkar for handling all the question and answer section in very professional way in all the webinar. Thank you very much, Professor Ayushi Ketkar.
My pleasure.
Okay. Next, I would like to thank Anjali Mishra ji. Anjali Mishra ji, who handling social media part so well. Thank you very much. And very important thing, we also thank. I would like to thank Lobsang Sidinla from Tibet Action Institute for taking care of the all technical part without any obstacle in between. Thank you, Lobsang Sidinla. At last, I would like to we thank audience who have taken part in our webinar today, virtually from different parts of the world. And thank you very much for all this, to all the people for making this webinar successful today. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So thank you, everybody. And once again, Michael, it was a wonderful discussion, one of our best webinars in recent past. And I'm sure very soon we are going to be with you all with a new subject. And incidentally, our next subject on 9th April is going to be self-immolations in Tibet. So we meet again very soon. And as I conclude, I would recommend especially the Tibetan youths, Tibetan scholars, to read this book, to use this book as one basic material for their own knowledge and for handling the arguments, debates which they have to face very regularly. I recommend this one. This book is like one window for those questions which are raised on Tibet. So thank you once again, everybody, especially Michael, and we meet again. So thank you,
Thank you,
everybody,
Vijay Kranti,
audience.
and all of you. Thank you, Vijay Kranti.